Hi, and welcome back to the channel. Thank you all for the remarkably positive feedback to my first video and also for the suggestions on how to improve. My second video will be commentary on the big Tucker Carlson interview with John Mearsheimer on July 31st. Most of you have probably already seen some clips from it, and I won't cover the entire interview, just the parts dealing with the war in Ukraine and the emerging Cold War with China. This first video will deal with Mearsheimer's views on Ukraine, and the second video will deal with China. I did listen to the whole interview from start to finish, and while I agree with Mearsheimer's broad strokes, there's quite a bit here that I think he's missing from his analysis. On Ukraine specifically, Mearsheimer makes the classic mistake of personifying nations, as in thinking of them as if they were a singular human being. So rather than considering what each faction within Ukraine wants, Mearsheimer lumps all these factions into a single monolithic entity. And frankly, we're all guilty of this kind of reductivist thinking. Most folks are nuanced enough to think of their own nations as a chaotic mix of conflicting factions, but when it comes to foreign nations, all of us have a tendency to view them as singular entities with singular agendas. We rarely afford them the same level of nuanced consideration as we do our own nations. So keep that in mind when listening to Mearsheimer here. Much of what Russia, Ukraine, and the US are doing in this war might seem foolish or stubborn on the surface, but are actually the result of compromises within rival factions or an attempt by one faction to benefit themselves, even at the expense of the greater national interest. Oh, and for those listening to this like a podcast, don't worry, Mearsheimer did not suddenly adopt the speaking cadence of Ben Shabibo. I'm just playing him on 1.5x speed. Anyway, without further ado, here's Dr. John Mearsheimer.
The fact is that the Russians are winning the war, and there's no way that Ukraine can rescue the situation. If you look at the balance of power in terms of weaponry and in terms of manpower, the number of soldiers that each side has, the Ukrainians are in a hopeless situation. And furthermore, they're heavily dependent on the West for support. And President Trump has made it clear that he's not going to refill the Biden pipeline once all the weaponry in that pipeline runs out. So the Ukrainians are doomed. And if you look at what's happening on the battlefield, it's quite clear that the Ukrainians understand that. Their defenses are slowly but steadily collapsing. Now, one might say, well, can't we get a negotiated settlement? Can't we bring this war to an end? And the fact is that neither the Ukrainians nor the West, and here we're talking mainly about the Europeans, is willing to cut a deal that's acceptable to the Russians. So there's no way you're going to have a diplomatic settlement to this war. It's going to be settled on the battlefield, and the Russians are going to win an ugly victory, and you're going to have a frozen conflict.
While Mearsheimer is correct that Russia is winning and it is very much in Ukraine's best interest to sue for peace as soon as possible, he should have explained that the reason why Ukraine isn't seriously suing for peace is because the personal interests of the Ukrainian leadership are not aligned with the national interests of Ukraine. There are two reasons for the Ukrainian leadership to keep this war going, even if it's not in their national interests. The first is that the men in the leadership are all financially benefiting from this war. The outright theft of Ukraine aid is rampant. Keep in mind that about a quarter of all aid to Ukraine is just cash, not weapons. So it's fairly easy to make that cash disappear into foreign bank accounts. And even the weapons themselves aren't safe from a bit of skimming, which is why Western weaponry meant for Ukraine has a tendency of showing up in battlefields far from Ukraine. The Ukrainian people are fully aware of all this rampant corruption. It's what they've come to expect from their leadership over the past 30 years. This is why there's been such a huge political scandal with Zelensky's new law to weaken the power of Ukraine's already feeble anti-corruption agencies. The second reason for the Ukrainian leadership to keep fighting this war, even if most of them realize that it's already unwinnable, is because of the simple problem of not wanting to be the first person to openly admit defeat. The saying goes that success has many fathers while failures are always orphans. This principle is why countries almost always keep fighting a war, even long after they've lost. Nobody wants to be the first person to stick their necks out to admit that the war has been lost. Everyone knows that the first brave soul to do that will become the father of that defeat.
Why can't you have a negotiated settlement?
Because Russia has a set of demands. There are three main demands, and I'll spell them out in a second. But they are unacceptable to the Ukrainians. They're unacceptable to the West. Donald Trump may find them acceptable, but he's surrounded by people in his administration, and certainly true in the American foreign policy establishment, who wouldn't accept those demands. And the big three demands are, number one, that Ukraine has to be a neutral state. It cannot be in NATO, and it cannot have a security guarantee from the United States or from the West more generally. So it has to be neutral. Second is that Ukraine cannot have a significant offensive military capability. Ukraine has to be demilitarized to the point where it doesn't present a threat to Russia. And then third, and maybe most important of all, the Ukrainians and the West have to accept the fact that Russia has annexed Crimea and those four oblasts in eastern one-fifth of Ukraine that they now almost occupy. So in other words, you're asking Ukraine to give up about 20% of its territory. And the Ukrainians won't do that. And they won't agree not to be in NATO. And they will not agree to disarm in some meaningful way. So there's no way you get a settlement.
Okay, I have to differ from Mearsheimer here. The truth is, Russia's conditions are acceptable to Western leaders for the simple reason that they really don't matter much to their personal interests at all. Whether some, war-torn town in eastern Ukraine has a Russian flag or Ukrainian flag flying over it means nothing to the likes of Ursula von der Leyen or Macron. Even Ukraine's future in or out of NATO is not as important as you might think, at least not to the folks who keep saying that it is. The fact is, Russia isn't a real threat to Brussels either way. And everyone knows it, even if no one in the European Union establishment wants to admit it. Real reason why European American leaders refuse to accept Russia's terms is because they're just politically captive to their own rhetoric over the past 3 years. Many, like Tucker Carlson, have built their political brand around fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. For these folks, admitting defeat and accepting Russian terms would be political suicide. So even if they know that it's in the best interests of the nations that they represent to end the war sooner than later, they're not going to be the first one to take the first bite from the poop sandwich. And for Trump in particular, he is a man that would rather start a nuclear war than to admit that he's been bested by another man. If he ends the war now, it would have to be on his terms, or at least look like it's on his terms. Accepting Russia's terms as is cannot be read as anything other than a capitulation to Putin. And for Trump, that is unacceptable because in his mind, Trump never loses, even if he's already lost.
So, but there will be a settlement by your description because there will be a victory. So there will just be, it's not an official settlement, but there will be a new status quo in which Russia controls a fifth of what was Ukraine. And that's just going to happen. So why wouldn't you want to get out of that with as little destruction as possible?
Well, you're going to get an armistice in all likelihood. And this is why we say you'll have a frozen conflict that will present all sorts of problems moving down the road. I have long argued that the Ukrainians should cut a deal now. Because what's going to happen is the Russians are going to end up taking more territory. And the Russians have made it clear that any territory they take, they'll keep. And furthermore, more Ukrainians are going to die the longer the war goes on. So if you believe like I do, and many people do, that Ukraine is losing, the smart thing to do is cut a deal now and minimize your losses, both in terms of territory and people killed on the battlefield. But you just can't sell that argument. And
why can't you sell that argument?
I think it's probably nationalism in the case of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians view the Russians as an existential threat, and they're willing to fight and die in huge numbers. They're willing to make incredible sacrifices to do everything they can to win this war, and they just won't quit.
So the Europeans and Americans are not the only ones who are trapped by their own political rhetoric. The man most imprisoned by it is Zelensky himself. His entire political career and legacy is built on resisting Russia to the last man, the last bullet. He passed a literal law at the beginning of this war that bans negotiations with Putin himself. So if he bends the knee to Russia's chief demands, then not only will his political career be over, but his very life will be in danger. The leadership in the West understands this too well, which is why there's been persistent rumors that there are discussions to replace Zelensky with the former Ukrainian commander-in-chief, Zelensky. a man who has been seen as a more pragmatic leader who is more willing to talk peace with the Russians. After all, he had fought them for almost 2 years, and he knows what the real prospects for Ukrainian victory are, namely that there are none. Again, diplomacy is all about personal interests, not national ones. The personal interests of national leaders never align perfectly with those of the nations that they lead. And in this war, as with all other wars, it's the losing side that is saddled with a leadership whose personal interests are wildly out of step with those of their nation. Ultimately, it's the Ukrainian people who have to suffer this.
And in terms of the West, it's easy for the
So I
West.
was supposed to say, I understand that and respect that. I think they're wrong, but I think it's self-defeating, but I certainly think it's honorable, those impulses, but I don't understand the West's stake in this exactly.
Well, I don't believe the West has a strategic stake in this for 1 second, but the Russophobia in the West is so powerful at this point in time that, especially among the elites in Europe and in the United States, that getting them to concede that the Russians have won this war or are going to win this war is just unacceptable.
And have legitimate security concerns on their border. I mean,
they're not allowed. The Russians are not allowed to have legitimate security concerns in the minds of most Western elites.
This goes back to my point about leaders being captive to their own rhetoric. Looking tough on Russia has always been one of the easiest ways to score political popularity points with Western voters. And since the rise of Putin, Western leaders have made whole careers on their anti-Russia stance. Now, in 2025, the bill has come due for all that rhetoric, and everyone is pretending to have forgotten their wallet at home.
Why?
I don't know. It befuddles me. If you look at the Russian reaction to NATO expansion into Ukraine, which I believe is the taproot of this war, it's analogous to America's Monroe Doctrine. The United States, under no circumstances, would allow the Soviet Union to put missiles in Cuba or to locate a naval base at Cienfuegos in Cuba. That was just unacceptable. This is what the Monroe Doctrine is all about.
Yes.
We'd never allow China to station military forces in Mexico or in Canada. But yet we think we have the right to move NATO far enough eastward to include Ukraine and then put NATO assets, including American military assets, in Ukraine. And this is not of concern to the Russians. They shouldn't care. They should recognize that Ukraine has the right to do whatever it wants. NATO has the right to expand wherever it wants. And Russia has no say in the matter. The Russians, of course, don't accept this because they have a Monroe Doctrine of their own. But we can't get it through our thick skulls that this is foolish thinking on our part and is destined to lead to trouble, as it has.
Again, Mearsheimer is too quick to jump to stupidity as an explanation here. I've said this before, but truly stupid national leaders are rare. Most only appear to be stupid because their interests don't align with those of their nation. In this case, American leaders refused to recognize Russia's legitimate security interests because Russia was simply too weak for them to care. This goes back to the whole Thucydides maxim, the strong do as they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Russia was weak, so Western leaders simply ignored their concerns, legitimate or otherwise. When this war is finally finished, the real Russian victory won't be some moonscape territory in eastern Ukraine. No. Their real victory will be the simple acknowledgement by the West that even though the Russian Federation isn't as strong as the USSR, isn't nearly as strong as the USSR rather, it's still a major power that deserves the kind of respect and deference that any major power is due. And only then will Russia's legitimate security interests, or any interests, be recognized by Western leaders.
It's interesting that the standard that U.S. foreign policymakers applied to Russia is different from a standard they'd apply to any other country, including China and even North Korea. They don't have the same level of emotion about any other place. It's Russia, Ukraine. And I find it baffling because on some level, this is, as you said at the outset, this is not about America's strategic interests. We don't really have many there. This is about an almost overwhelming emotional response from our leadership class to this conflict, to this region. I think it's weird.
Tucker is right here that North Korea and China are both afforded more respect than Russia. In China's case, this is because China's simply stronger. It's got 10 times Russia's population and GDP and a far more powerful navy. In North Korea's case, this is because it holds South Korea hostage. And unlike Ukraine, Western leaders actually care about whether or not South Korea stays in one piece.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think also at this point in time, we have convinced ourselves, both the Europeans and the Americans, that Russia is a mortal threat to dominate all of Europe. This is a ridiculous argument.
Do you think it is ridiculous?
It's a ridiculous argument. As you have seen, the war started in 2022. We're well over 5 years into this war. And the Russians have had a very difficult time conquering the eastern 1/5 of Ukraine. Just think about that. Over 3+ years, they have been unable to conquer all of the territory in those 4 oblasts that they've annexed. Please tell me how this army is going to overrun all of Ukraine, then overrun Eastern Europe, and then overrun Western Europe. This is a laughable argument. Furthermore, if the Russians are foolish enough to try to occupy Western Ukraine, they're going to find themselves in a quagmire. They're going to find themselves dealing with a huge amount of resistance from all of those ethnic Ukrainians in the western part of Ukraine who hate Russians. This is why I don't think Putin is going to even try to conquer the western half.
Much less Poland and Romania and the rest.
Exactly.
Again, none of these EU leaders really think that Russian tanks are going to be rolling down the streets of Warsaw anytime soon. This is all just political grandstanding for them. Even the increase in defense spending is just a way for them to benefit their buddies in the defense industry. This is why Europeans continue to waste money with fancy tanks and jets that have proven to be much too expensive to use in modern warfare. If they really cared about winning wars, they'd be spending all their money on small drone development.
Their view on that, by the way, in terms of occupying Eastern Europe, is we've been there, done that, and it did not work out very well. Remember, they occupied Eastern Europe roughly from 1945 to the early 1990s when they pulled out after the Cold War ended. They had to invade Hungary in 56. They had to invade Czechoslovakia in 68. They had to put down a major insurrection in East Germany in 1953. They almost went into Poland 3 times. They had their hands full dealing with the Romanians and the Albanians and the Yugoslavs. I mean, the idea that a country like Russia is going to, invade and occupy and run the politics of countries in Eastern Europe is a remarkably foolish idea. And again, they don't even have the military capability to do that.
Everything Mearsheimer says here is correct and common knowledge to the EU political class, many of whom are old enough to have lived through much of it. So again, it would be naive to assume that none of them have drawn the same obvious conclusion as Mearsheimer, that the Russians don't want to occupy Eastern Europe, even if they had the military capacity to do so. Putin is not a cartoon supervillain bent on global conquest, even if Western leaders like to pretend that he is.
But that is the idea. And when you talk to Europeans about it, as I often do, they say that Putin's aim is to restore the Soviet Empire. And he said that, and just listen to what he says. He pines for the Soviet era, and he wants to restore it.
He's never said that. In fact, he said that, he can understand why someone in his or her heart pines for the Soviet Union, but in his or her head, it makes absolutely no sense. He said that. The idea that you can recreate the Soviet Union, number one, and then 2, recreate the Soviet Empire is a pipe dream. And you might not like Vladimir Putin, but he is a very smart man. He is a first-class strategist, and he surely understands that, the idea of recreating the Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire makes no sense at all.
Yeah, Putin's statements are not a state secret. Even if EU media has been doing everything possible to strawman Putin's demands, most EU leaders have met Putin in person and know what kind of person he really is and what he really wants. Again, this is all just kabuki theater to boost their careers through anti-Russian rhetoric.
You spent 10 years in the U.S. military, graduated West Point during the Cold War.
Yes.
So your life for 10 years was focused on the Soviets, of course.
No question.
No question. So that's 10 years. That's a long time in your young life. How were you able to transition mentally from viewing Russia as an enemy to viewing them as, another country?
It's an interesting question.
And why weren't others able to do that?
Well, a lot were, but a lot weren't. I think that what happened was that during the Cold War, when I started to think about the U.S.-Soviet competition, the subject that I got interested in was the conventional balance of forces in Europe. It was the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance. And I wrote my dissertation on the subject of conventional deterrence, and it focused on the NATO-Warsaw Pact balance. And my argument was, which was very controversial at the time, was that the Soviets were not 10 feet tall, and that actually if a war did break out in Central Europe, the West or NATO would do very well, that we would hold off the Soviets, that they would not win a quick and decisive victory, which is the conventional wisdom at the time. So in a very important way, I was engaged in threat deflation.
Now, this point is quite interesting. Obviously, as a young West Point intel officer, Mearsheimer didn't have access to any intel that was out of reach for any Western politician at the time. So if a 20-something Mearsheimer could have seen through the ruse of Soviet power, then so could many others. People often forget that the American military-industrial complex was just as active in manipulating American foreign policy during the Cold War as they are today. Back then, the USSR was the only credible threat to the Western world order, so weapons salesmen had to play up the threat of the Soviets in order to sell the next overpriced and underdeveloped tank, plane, or submarine. So it wasn't a case of Mearsheimer being some strategic prodigy. The old men in charge at the time just had their own private agendas, namely helping their buddies in the defense industry steal from the American taxpayer.
I always thought when you looked at the Soviet Union, this is during the latter part of the Cold War when I was coming of age, that we greatly overestimated the threat and that the Soviet Union was not 10 feet tall. So once the Cold War ends and then we segue into the unipolar moment, I'm already moving in that direction. And then during the 1990s, the Soviet Union, which has become Russia, is a total basket case. I mean, it's the only threat that it represents is to itself.
Yes.
It doesn't represent a threat to the West. And in fact, Tucker, NATO expansion, which really gets going in 1994, that's when Bill Clinton decides to expand NATO, is not designed to contain Russia because there is no Russian threat. So then Putin comes to power. And what happens from about 2000 up until the present is that the West, and here we're talking about the United States as well, of course, becomes increasingly Russophobic and hostile to Putin. And I think it's in large part because Putin stands up to us. I think that we get used to the idea, certainly in the 1990s, that we call the shots. It's the unipolar moment. And when we tell countries to jump, their only question is how high. And we get away with that to some extent with Putin to begin with. But then he begins to play hardball with us. And he gives a very famous speech in Munich in 2007 where he throws down the gauntlet. And from 2007 forward, relations really deteriorate. And as they deteriorate, the Russophobia comes racing to the fore and remains firmly in place today.
This is another great example of why you always need to keep personal interests in mind when analyzing geopolitics. While elected officials are always looking for ways to boost their popularity through tough rhetoric, lifelong professional bureaucrats are always trying to justify their own jobs, even if that means creating a problem just so they can appear to be solving it. This is why American political class kept provoking Russia with NATO expansion in the 1990s and 2000s. They knew it would piss off the Russians and force Moscow into a defensive posture. This plays right into their hands because that tough talk coming out of the Kremlin is the perfect excuse to fund that new stealth fighter or that new nuclear submarine. After all, back in those years, China wasn't yet considered a credible threat, so the only boogeyman left was still Russia, even if it was a shadow of its former Soviet self. So, there you have it. I agree with Mearsheimer's general positions on Ukraine, but he's missing the dimension of personal motivations and how they play into national decisions. My next video will be on the China segment of this interview, and that will release next week. So subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon.